So you walked from Vienna, Austria,
to Budapest.
in Hungary?
Yeah.
In 1940, the Kingdom of Hungary joined the Axis powers. Hungarian armed forces participated in the invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941, as well as the invasion of the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945. During the Battle of Stalingrad, Hungarian forces sustained 100,000 casualties. As rumors of a Hungarian peace treaty with the Allies reached Germany, Hitler launched Operation Margaret. Jews under the previous Hungarian government had been mostly spared, but under German occupation, no one was safe. Long Island and New York City hold the most Holocaust survivors in the world. After contacting the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove, New York, they very graciously gave us the opportunity to speak to a survivor. Mr. Stephen Berger was first condemned to the Budapest ghetto in 1944. He was then transferred to Strausshof concentration camp and later to Wien-Birkenau, both in Austria.
In 1944, June 1st, the first air raid in town. They bombed the railroad station, and after the raid was over, SS and Hungarian gendarmes came into the ghetto. They took all the able-bodied men, took us out to the railroad station to clear the rubble, designated one of the waiting rooms as a makeshift morgue, and my job was to pull dead bodies out from the rubble, bring them into this makeshift morgue, and while we bringing these bodies into this makeshift morgue, we had to pass a line of SS men. They were beating us with rifle butts, with bayonets, accusing us that we called the American Air Force. So at the day I was so blooded, I didn't know it was my own blood or the blood of the bodies I was carrying. I knew I had to cleanse myself with something. Back in the ghetto, I couldn't use the water because they closed the water to the ghetto. But we had kerosene, so I washed myself completely down with kerosene.
So right before you knew you were going to be moving to a camp, how did you prepare for that?
We were not prepared at all. We had only a knapsack with us, that's all. And you moved automatically, you know, whatever they told you to do, you were just doing it.
Could you tell us about traveling to the concentration camps?
That was the cattle car ride. That was the most terrible things I ever experienced, that 3.5 days. Some people said it was more than 3.5 days, but I figure, what's 3.5 days? It's completely crowded into the cattle car with no space, no air to breathe. You had no water, you had no food. It was June, very hot day, and a miserable 3.5 days. The smell was unbearable because there was no place to go. So the old people and the sick people and the children couldn't hold it back. They were doing it on the floor. So it was an unbearable experience. The wood barracks were already filled up. We didn't have no space in there. We camped outdoors in an open field, and you have to picture this, that thousands of people standing on an open field, an SS officer standing in front of us, and German trucks pull into the campground, requisiting slave labor. It was very cheap. Everybody wanted have slave labor. But of course the SS, the factories paid the price for the SS, for our labor. A small truck pulls up in front of us with two civilians, and the SS officer calls out, he says, "Who's a mechanic here?" Mechanic. So I figured if there's a mechanic, they're not going to harm you, right? I said, "I'm a mechanic." So he says, "Go in the truck." I said, "I cannot go. I have my mother and sister here with me." But at the time, I didn't know that you cannot argue with an SS officer. So I didn't move. He told me the second time to go on the truck. And I didn't say a word, but I didn't move. And that's when he put his right hand on his holster, leather holster, and he told me the third time to move on the truck. I didn't move. And that's when one of the civilians who came on the truck stepped up to him. He said something into his ears, and the SSL officer looked at me, and he says, "Where is your mother and sister?" So I pointed them out behind me on the line, and he says, "Bring them along." It was my lucky day, because life was very cheap. Of course, I didn't know at the time, but now I know. He could have shot me with no problem at all. But we all went on the truck. They chose another 18 or so more people, and they took us to Vienna, to a factory called Urani and Wolfram, 29 Passetti Strasse in Vienna. And we started to work in this factory as slave laborers.
When were you liberated, and who liberated you?
I was liberated in April 1945 by the Russians.
What did you do right after you were liberated?
The next one, we had to go back to Hungary to see what happened to my father and the rest of the family. Of course, there was no transportation, we had to walk. And when we got back in town, my father was already there. But of course, we found out that my mother's family was almost completely wiped out.
And do you have any feelings towards Germany today?
Not the young generation. Of course, the old one probably dying out. I never forget and I never forgive. The crime was just too great to forgive.
Do you think the importance of history is stressed enough in the United States today?
No. No, Americans don't want to learn history. That's why they're getting beaten all the time. Matter of fact, if I would have my chance, every politician who runs for office would have a PhD, at least, in history.
What's the most important thing that you've learned in your experience that you want to teach younger generations?
That the next generations of victims are always those who neglect to study and heed history.